America's very first stock market crash was so brutal, so devastating that it nearly ended the nation before it even began. Not in the 1900s, not even during the Great Depression. This disaster struck in 1792, when the ink on the Constitution was barely dry. At the center of it all, two men who thought they could outsmart an entire economy, William Duer and Alexander Macomb, names long forgotten, but once whispered with fear across Wall Street. They weren't just gamblers, they were architects of chaos. And when their reckless empire of paper money and speculation came crashing down, America's financial system nearly collapsed with it. But the real question is, how did two men almost destroy the future of a nation? In March of 1792, Wall Street was still just a narrow street in lower Manhattan, muddy, chaotic, and buzzing with speculation. But what unfolded here would make modern crashes look like child's play. Duer and Macomb had orchestrated a scheme so audacious, it feels unbelievable today. A plot to dominate the debt securities market, the very backbone of America's young financial system. Their trick was deceptively simple. Sign each other's notes to conjure vast loans out of nothing, and then use that credit to corner the market. It was bold, it was reckless, and for a moment, it worked. Prices soared, fortunes doubled overnight. Wall Street's first fever dream was underway. But beneath the glittering promise of easy wealth, their empire was nothing more than a fragile house of cards. And when it collapsed violently. Securities prices didn't just fall. They plunged 25% in a matter of weeks. The young American economy buckled, and chaos rippled through every merchant, every bank, every investor who had bet on this new dream. And in the wreckage, only one man had the power to save the nation from complete financial ruin. But before we can understand how the crash unfolded and how America was dragged to the edge of destruction, we need to go back to the brilliant idea that created this monster in the first place. It all began with a new idea, one so revolutionary that it would change the fate of the United States forever. When America won independence, the nation wasn't just politically fragile, it was financially broken. The Revolutionary War had left Congress drowning in unpaid debts. Soldiers went home with IOUs instead of wages. Farmers who had supplied the army were left with scraps of worthless paper. The young nation's credit was in tatters. Enter Alexander Hamilton, the ambitious Treasury Secretary who believed America could reinvent itself through finance. His bold plan? Consolidate all those messy state and federal debts into one unified system, backed by the federal government. For the first time, America would issue government securities, pieces of paper that represented promises of repayment with interest. To Hamilton, this wasn't just accounting, it was nation-building. He wanted these securities to become the backbone of a brand new financial market that could fuel America's growth. But there was a problem. Hamilton's idea created a new asset class, one that was stable, backed by the government, and traded freely. But in the shadows, speculators saw something different, a golden opportunity. If these securities could be manipulated, they could turn borrowed money into instant fortunes. This is where William Duer and Alexander Macomb stepped onto the stage. Both were men of status. Duer, a former assistant Treasury Secretary with powerful connections, and Macomb, one of New York's richest land speculators. Together, they saw Hamilton's debt system not as a national safety net, but as the perfect casino. Their scheme was simple but dangerous. They began signing each other's notes, financial promises to pay, and used these paper pledges to secure massive loans from unsuspecting banks and merchants. With this artificially inflated credit, they bought up government securities in bulk, driving up prices and convincing everyone else that fortunes could be made. It was brilliant, it was reckless, and for a brief moment, it worked. Securities prices soared. Ordinary merchants mortgaged their futures to join the frenzy. Wall Street, still just a dirt road lined with coffee houses and merchant shops, was caught in the fever. The market wasn't just hot, it was overheated. Duer and Macomb believed they were untouchable, but what they had really built wasn't wealth. It was a financial monster, an unstable bubble growing bigger by the day. And just like every monster, it was destined to break free from its master's control. Duer was no ordinary merchant. He had sat at the heart of government finance, serving as Secretary of the Treasury Board under the Articles of Confederation, and later as Hamilton's Assistant Treasury Secretary. He had insider knowledge of America's fragile credit system, knowledge so sensitive that Congress had eventually barred Treasury officials from securities speculation. Duer's response? He resigned rather than give up the game. But his reputation as a man who knew the secrets of the Treasury clung to him like gold dust. To investors, he wasn't just a player, he was the man with the map to hidden treasure. Macomb brought something equally valuable: money. Vast wealth from land speculation and mercantile trade. Together, they were fire and gunpowder. Macomb's fortune provided the fuse, and Duer's connections supplied the spark. Their plan was breathtaking in its audacity. They would corner the U.S. government securities market, buying up debt certificates in bulk, choking supply, and forcing prices sky high. Why did this matter? Because investors desperately needed those securities to purchase stock in the brand new Bank of the United States. Without them, transactions couldn't be completed, which meant Duer and Macomb didn't just control paper. They controlled the lifeblood of America's banking system. They weren't investing. They were holding the market hostage. To fund this empire, they invented a shadow credit system of their own. Each man signed promissory notes for the other, endorsements stacked on endorsements like mirrors reflecting mirrors. It was money conjured from thin air, a paper carousel of mutual guarantees that convinced lenders to pour cash into their scheme. To outside creditors, these signatures looked like collateral. In reality, they were smoke and mirrors, a dangerous illusion of wealth that allowed them to borrow far beyond their true means. And their ambition didn't stop with speculation. Duer and Macomb wanted to build an empire that could crush Hamilton's allies outright. Their ultimate goal was the creation of a new bank in New York, powerful enough to topple the Bank of New York and rival even Hamilton's federal institution. This wasn't just profiteering, it was a bid to seize control of America's financial future, to make themselves kings of credit in a nation barely learning what credit meant. Duer was even more dangerous than his partner realized. While publicly championing their grand banking vision, he was secretly betting against the Bank of New York in his private accounts, shorting the very institution he pretended to support. He was gambling on collapse while promising stability, playing both sides in a game where one wrong move could destroy everything. By early 1792, the facade looked flawless. Duer and Macomb had weaved a web of credit and speculation so vast that investors believed it unbreakable. Prices kept climbing, creditors kept lending, and Wall Street, still just a dusty street lined with coffeehouses, felt like the center of the world. But beneath the surface, the system was rotting. Their empire wasn't built on gold, silver, or even land. It was built on paper promises stacked on top of each other. And everyone knows what happens when the bottom sheet slips. What Duer and Macomb didn't see, or refused to admit, was that the very institution propping up their rise, the Bank of the United States, was quietly bleeding reserves. And once the money stopped flowing, their paper empire would collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. The reckoning was coming. For months it seemed unstoppable. Prices soared, speculation intensified, and William Duer's empire appeared untouchable. But while Wall Street danced to the tune of easy money, the Bank of the United States, the very pillar of the system, was quietly running out of oxygen. Between December 29th and March 9th, the bank's reserves collapsed by more than a third. Cash wasn't just leaving, it was bleeding out. What had once looked like limitless credit suddenly resembled a leaking barrel, draining faster than anyone imagined. Behind closed doors, the directors panicked. They weren't watching the birth of a stable financial system. They were watching it being hollowed out by reckless speculation. Then came the hammer blow. In March 1792, the bank abruptly tightened its lending. Overnight, 1/4 of its short-term loans were allowed to expire, cut off, gone, no extensions. Borrowers who had grown fat on rollover credit suddenly faced demands for immediate payment. The cozy rhythm of borrowed money, the heartbeat of speculation, flatlined without warning. To the speculators, it was a financial earthquake. One day the floor felt solid. The next, it crumbled beneath their feet. Duer and Macomb, who had built their empire on borrowed cash, were suddenly trapped. Their entire scheme depended on the assumption that credit would never dry up, that each loan could be refinanced with another, that the carousel would keep spinning forever. But when the banks shut off the tap, their towering edifice of paper promises began to sway. And they weren't the only ones. Other speculators, just as over-leveraged, scrambled to find cash. With no loans available, they began to dump securities at any price just to stay afloat. Selling begot more selling. Prices tumbled. The very market Duer and Macomb had once controlled was collapsing in a cascade of panic. Confidence evaporated as fast as the credit. Investors who had felt invincible only days earlier now faced the cold reality of ruin. Their sure thing was gone. The bubble had burst. On Wall Street, fear spread like wildfire. Coffee houses once filled with smug laughter turned into chambers of dread as men whispered about unpaid notes and collapsing fortunes. The same signatures that had once created an illusion of limitless wealth now looked like chains pulling speculators into the abyss. And at the center of it all was William Duer. The man who had promised inside knowledge and stability was revealed to be the most overextended of them all. His duplicity, borrowing recklessly, shorting banks behind his partner's back, and gambling on endless credit, now turned into the noose tightening around his empire. The system that had made Duer and Macomb kings of paper was now dragging them down with it. The crash wasn't just financial, it was psychological. America's first generation of investors was learning a brutal truth. Wealth built on borrowed confidence collapses the moment that confidence disappears. The music had stopped, and now everyone was scrambling for a chair. The unraveling didn't just hit speculators, it tore through the entire young nation's financial system. By March, what had begun as whispers of trouble became full-blown panic. New York's bustling coffee houses, once filled with booming voices of confidence, now echoed with rumors of collapse. Merchants huddled in corners, clutching account books, while runners darted through the streets with grim news. Credit had vanished, and all eyes turned to one man, William Duer. His empire, once propped up by endless borrowing, had collapsed under its own weight. Creditors pounded on his door, demanding repayment. But Duer, the man who had once lived in glittering luxury, couldn't even meet the smallest obligations. His fall was spectacular. By mid-March 1792, he was forced into debtor's prison, shackled not by law but by the mountain of promises he could never keep. News of his downfall sent shockwaves through the city. If a man with Duer's government connections, wealth, and reputation could be ruined, then no one was safe. Panic spread like a contagion. Other speculators who had leaned on his endorsements suddenly found their credit worthless. Banks and merchants, terrified of exposure, began calling in loans, refusing new credit, and hoarding cash. The result was a chain reaction of defaults. Securities once worth fortunes now sold for pennies on the dollar. Investors who had leveraged everything, homes, businesses, reputations, were wiped out overnight. Entire families were ruined. Riots erupted in New York streets as angry creditors and desperate speculators clashed outside coffee houses and bank doors. The collapse wasn't just about numbers on ledgers, it was visceral. Men who had been boasting of riches weeks before were now begging for bread. Some fled the city in disgrace, others took their own lives, unable to face the humiliation of ruin. And in the midst of the carnage, Alexander Hamilton, now Treasury Secretary, watched with alarm. He had helped create America's financial system, and now he was staring at its possible destruction. For Hamilton, this wasn't just a financial collapse. It was an existential threat to the credibility of the new republic. If confidence in markets and banks evaporated entirely, the young nation's credit, its very ability to borrow from abroad and sustain itself, would be obliterated. Hamilton knew he had to act, and fast. The Panic of 1792 wasn't just America's first financial crisis. It was a test of whether the fledgling nation's financial system could even survive its own reckless ambitions. And in the ashes of Duer's empire, the question now hung in the air. Could Hamilton stabilize the storm before it consumed everything? The Treasury Secretary wasn't just a policymaker at this moment. He was the only figure who could stop America's fragile financial system from tearing itself apart. From his office in Philadelphia, Hamilton received frantic reports from New York. Collapsing securities prices, merchants unable to meet payroll, riots spilling into the streets. The air was thick with fear. Credit had evaporated, and the first great experiment in American finance seemed on the verge of total collapse. Hamilton's response was nothing short of revolutionary. Without precedent, without approval from any playbook, he effectively invented a bailout strategy on the spot. His weapon wasn't speeches or politics, it was money deployed with precision. The Treasury began quietly buying back government securities on the open market, pouring desperately needed liquidity into the system. This had a dual effect. It propped up plummeting prices while signaling to terrified investors that the government itself stood behind the nation's credit. Suddenly, securities that looked worthless yesterday carried a hidden guarantee, Hamilton's Treasury. But he didn't stop there. Hamilton leaned on the Bank of the United States, persuading its directors to loosen credit just enough to prevent total collapse. Instead of a relentless squeeze, the bank extended lifelines to solvent merchants, preventing the panic from consuming every corner of the economy. In doing so, Hamilton walked a tightrope. Provide enough liquidity to calm the markets without fueling the same speculative mania that caused the disaster. This was central banking before America had a central bank, and it worked. Slowly, confidence began to trickle back into the system. Merchants who had been dumping securities for pennies held firm. Investors realized the government wasn't going to let the market collapse into oblivion. By April 1792, the worst of the storm had passed. The panic eased, prices stabilized, and America's young financial system survived its first great test. But Hamilton's intervention came at a cost. Critics accused him of favoring wealthy speculators and entrenching the very system that had caused the crisis. They argued he had set a dangerous precedent, that Wall Street could gamble recklessly, knowing the government would step in to clean up the mess. In reality, Hamilton had no choice. Without his swift and daring action, America's fragile financial system might have collapsed entirely, before the Republic itself had even celebrated its third birthday. The Panic of 1792 revealed the dark side of speculation, but it also revealed Hamilton's genius. He understood that confidence was the lifeblood of finance. If people believed the system would survive, it would. And if they didn't, no amount of laws or ledgers could save it. Hamilton's rescue plan wasn't just about stabilizing markets. It was about saving America's experiment in capitalism from dying in its infancy. By the spring of 1792, the storm had passed. Markets steadied, merchants reopened their shops, and the immediate panic was contained. But underneath the surface, scars remained. William Duer, the once celebrated insider, was now reviled as the villain of Wall Street's first great crash. His empire of circular loans and reckless bets had collapsed overnight, leaving creditors ruined. Duer himself landed in debtor's prison, a humiliating fall from grace that symbolized the dangers of unchecked speculation. For the rest of his life, he would be remembered not as a founding financier, but as America's first too-big-to-fail speculator, who failed spectacularly. Alexander Macomb, his partner in financial manipulation, escaped prison, but not infamy. His vast land holdings collapsed in value, and his reputation as a market manipulator followed him like a shadow. He would never again wield the same influence on Wall Street. But the real legacy of the Panic of 1792 wasn't the ruin of two men. It was the blueprint it etched into America's financial DNA. Because while Hamilton's intervention saved the system, it also revealed a dangerous precedent. Speculators could gamble knowing the government might step in to cushion the fall. That quiet, almost invisible precedent would echo through American history, from the railroad booms of the 1800s to the stock market crash of 1929, from the bailouts of 2008 to the liquidity injections of today. In the ashes of 1792 lay the origin story of a cycle that still defines modern finance: risk, collapse, and rescue. The Panic of 1792 wasn't just a market correction. It was the birth of American capitalism as we know it. It proved three things. 1. Speculation is inevitable. Give people a market and credit, and they will push it to extremes. 2. Confidence is everything. Once trust breaks, even the strongest institutions can unravel in days. 3. Government will intervene. Whether by design or desperation, leaders will step in when collapse threatens the system itself. That combination, unrestrained speculation, fragile confidence, and government rescue, became the rhythm of Wall Street. It played out in the 1837 panic, in the banking crises of the 19th century, in the 1929 crash, in the dot-com bubble, and in the subprime meltdown of 2008. Each time, the players changed, the instruments evolved, but the underlying script, written in 1792, remained the same. Hamilton didn't set out to create moral hazard. He was simply trying to save a nation that was barely 3 years old from financial ruin. But in doing so, he cemented an uncomfortable truth. Markets don't run on mathematics alone. They run on psychology, politics, and power. That's why America's first crash still matters today. It wasn't just a financial hiccup. It was a revelation of how fragile and how resilient capitalism could be. It showed us that speculation can build empires as easily as it can destroy them. It showed us that government, once involved, could never again fully step away. And perhaps most haunting of all, it showed that even in its infancy, Wall Street already looked eerily familiar. The greed, the leverage, the bailout, it was all there 230 years ago. So the next time a modern crisis shakes the markets and Washington rushes to stabilize the system, remember, we've been here before. In fact, we never really left 1792. If you found this video insightful, like, share, and hit the subscribe button to join our community for more deep dives into untold financial history stories and groundbreaking revelations shaping the global economy. Click the next video for another intriguing narrative. Thanks for watching.